it's Jordyn Swingle with Let's Just Be Real. In a world where we can put a spin and a filter on everything, this podcast is going to be raw and honest about all the things. And I do mean all the things. So let's get to it. Mess with my son and I'll mess you up.
She's starting off with such a fully loaded question.
And I live as a beneficiary of their selflessness.
God looked all over the world and he picked you.
Well, hi, y'all. I am so excited. Always. Every time I get to do this, I'm excited. But I'm especially excited today because we are going to talk about something that is incredibly dear to my heart. And we're going to talk about it with a very sweet friend of mine. And that topic is adoption. And my sweet friend here is Julia Stringham. And I cannot wait for you to get to share all the things. Thank you so much for, first of all, just agreeing to this and being willing to share your heart and your testimony. And I think that this is such a huge conversation in our lives personally. And just, I don't often get to hear from someone who's been adopted, right?
Yeah,
I'm an adoptive mom. And so to get to hear your perspective, I'm just really excited to share that. And I'm excited to chit chat with you.
Yes. Well,
how do you feel being in the hot seat?
Well, you know.
Mixed emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of have to forget that, like, there's cameras.
I know. Just talking. We're just chatting. It's just us in a coffee shop, you know? So you and I connected a couple months ago, just getting coffee and reconnecting after not seeing each other for a long time. And I got to hear parts of your story. I know.
Where we met.
Yeah.
College. That's a long time ago.
But I got to hear parts of your story that just were so insightful to me and so helpful. And I want to talk through that. I also just want to talk to you as a human, like, and hear about the other things that you're passionate about and the things that you love. So let's start with, like I say, in every podcast, we give a foundation of understanding of who my people are because I know you, but the crowd doesn't. So I want to hear about your upbringing and your childhood. Obviously, that looks a little bit different than the standard, bio family unit.
For sure.
So talk to us about your earliest memories of, like, childhood and what that was like.
So my earliest memories of childhood. So, wow. I was thinking about these questions because then you sent them to me and I was like, she's starting off with such a fully loaded question. It's great, Let's see. So I was adopted when I was 6 months old. I was adopted from Guatemala, which they don't do those anymore. Now it's like,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they closed the doors on that, which is kind of sad, but so much going on in the world. And then, so what's great, no, I shouldn't say what's great, but what's interesting, I guess, about my story is, my parents couldn't have children back in the 80s. It was just an unexplained infertility. Nowadays, people can do more root issue looking into that. But my parents also had a heart for adoption. They came from a church that really had a heart for missions as they were traveling to Guatemala, they were traveling to Poland, they were traveling to China. And so, it's kind of interesting to look at the culture of that church at the time. It was very much about missions and, like, how can we serve people? How can we, so my parents just decided, they're like, I think we should adopt. We've both wanted to. That came up when we were dating and all that stuff. So, and the way that it happened is so crazy because they were doing missions work in Guatemala, so they had connections, and this lawyer called the church and said, hey, we have a baby that's going to be born, needs to be placed for adoption. Do you have a family?
Yeah.
And to me, like, I have not heard of a church, like, someone calling and saying, hey, does somebody want to adopt this kid? I just have not. It's such a strange dynamic because I just haven't seen that in the church. And my parents were like, yes, like, we want to adopt her. What do you want to name her? So they went down and at 3 months, so this is kind of where my story gets a little crazy. So at 3 months, they went down there and my parents paid, because, back then adoption was like $5,000.
Oh, yeah.
Now it's like,
so affordable comparatively.
Like a whole year's salary.
Yeah. For
different reasons. And so they paid to have me kind of placed in more of with a nanny. I'm not going to an orphanage. And that nanny grew to really, like, attach herself to me. And so at 3 months old, the nanny was also the lawyer's mother. She had convinced him to not finish the paperwork. So you're talking like 2 adoptive parents going down thinking that they're going to have a baby.
Yeah.
Going to take home a baby and finding out that they can't. And so my mom was like, that was the moment where, like, she just had to trust the Lord. She
Yeah.
was like, I want to know that I'm
I have chills.
getting the same baby. I want to know that, like, you know. And so I have a little spot on my ear, and my mom was like, the Lord just marked you, so I would know that I was getting the same baby.
Mm-hmm.
So can you imagine like leaving like
No,
the country? Because they were like, what should we do? Do we leave? Do we stay? Like in those moments, you're just really relying on the Lord.
And you're trusting people that you don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So 3 months later, they finished the paperwork. I go down and I have, you know, a 6-month-old baby. I've already attached myself to this lady. And so it became a whole big ordeal, traumatizing for me. I feel bad for my parents because it's just like, you know, they are like opening their hearts to love a child. And I'm like,
I don't want anything to do with you.
I know who you are. I've been, you know,
with this family.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that kind of, I feel like, set me up for some issues later, which we'll talk about. But the Lord really like healed my heart with my adoptive parents, who, you know, I refer to as my parents.
Yeah.
So like kind of through that, my mom said my mom said she experienced me with some like panic attacks and just, you know, your typical kind of,
as like an infant.
Yes. Like, you know, just young and like anxiety, you know, which comes with kind of having a traumatic experience with the adoption. So, and the truth was my biological father threatened to kill my biological mother and me if she gave birth to me. So she ran for her life. She already had 4 children.
Oh my gosh.
She ran, had me, placed me for adoption within that same day, and then went back. And so I can't even imagine what that must have felt like.
And the trauma that she's under.
So growing up, I had a really great childhood. I mean, I definitely kind of had I knew I was different. I knew that like I didn't look like my parents. But surprisingly, because I think of the church culture that we were in, the community that we were in, nobody was ever like made me feel bad for being like, I don't look like my parents. Nobody was like, yeah, well, you're adopted. Like I didn't have that experience. And I'm really blessed to say that. I know
that
it's
is
not
incredible.
I know that's not true for everybody. So then, my parents, this is like one of my favorite things about my childhood. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad would come home, and the evening routine was kind of our thing.
Mm-hmm.
So he would put me to bed, and I would ask him to tell me a bedtime story. And I said, you know, I'd always be like, Daddy, can you tell me like how you got me? So he would say, you know, Mom and I met at church. You know, I kissed her when I asked her to marry me. Not just being I'm like, oh, this is so great, you know. And then, you know, we got married, and then, you know, we couldn't have children, but that was never like the focus. It was never like we couldn't have kids, so we got you.
No.
It was like God looked all over the world. We asked God to give us children, and God looked all over the world, and He picked you.
Oh, I love that.
And so it was so like it was so that, I mean, I grew up I can remember that like since I was little, probably since, you know, 3, you know. And so that was always my favorite bedtime story. I always wanted to know that. So
Campbell asks us that all the time. He asks me to tell him we tell him his story about us driving home from Arkansas. And I think it started out because I would make funny noises. Like he was 2 days old, and so he would cry so much in the car because he ate every 2 hours on the hour.
Okay.
And he loves that story. And I think initially it was like, he thought it was funny because mommy was making baby noises. And now he like asks like, and where did I come from? And where did you drive? And tell me who was at the house waiting for me when I got to Texas. Like he wants to know those details, and he's only 4.
Yeah.
But I'm going to steal that term of God looked all over the world. That is so
it was just one of my like, I don't know. So that stuck with me for a long time. So my parents never hid the fact that I was adopted.
Yeah.
They never made it this like, oh, you're different. You know, obviously that kind of comes with just like, yeah, like you didn't come from mommy's
belly.
Yes. You came from someone else's belly. And my parents, probably about the age of like 10 or 11. So we were missionaries. So we moved to a third world country when I was 8. So talk about trying to find out where you fit in just as an adopted person, but then also you're in a different country. And so like, that's a whole nother, like that could be a whole nother podcast. Like my childhood of like living as missionaries overseas. And so, but I also had an understanding of like other cultures and other people. And I rely on that, today, even just professionally, of just like not everybody grew up the same as you, and make room for people's experiences. So my parents had asked probably when I was like preteen, do you want to meet your biological family? Are you curious? They always kind of left that door open. And I was like, at preteen, like, I don't really care about anything about myself. I was like, oh, like, why would I want to do that? And I remember my mom told me later that the Lord specifically told her, says, don't ask her again. She'll come to you when she's ready. And so my mom was like, okay, we're not going to
push it.
Yeah. So, so I can look back now kind of as an adult who's done some work in healing. I still struggled with rejection, feeling of abandonment. I can recognize it now through a lot of my own deep work and healing of like, I can see where I feel like people are abandoning me. I can feel rejected, and I can choose to stay in that or choose to acknowledge it and work through it and bring in truth. But I mean, as a teenager, you're dealing with your regular things that teens deal with. And it wasn't until I went to a discipleship school when I was about 18, 19. I would say that I grew up, I'm an only child and I'm adopted and I'm a girl.
Right.
I didn't really suffer, even though we were missionaries. My parents did a great job of providing for me in a lot of ways that I think that had they had more kids, we had not, my dad's very financially sound. Even though we didn't have much money, he stewarded it very well. So I didn't really go without a lot. We still struggled because we lived in a third world country. Like sometimes we didn't have water. I think that was kind of the Lord's way of like humbling me a little bit of like, you're special, but you still have
but you don't go through the same things other people go through.
So then we lived in Hungary. So we went from Ukraine to Hungary, and we lived on an island in the Mediterranean for a while. And I went back when I graduated high school. So I would say I grew up, to be very honest, let's just be real. I grew up very entitled, in my older teens, young adult years. I tell about I was 20, really, 18, 19, 20. And I could manipulate my way to get what I wanted. I could, my parent, I was, again, an only child, kind of played on that.
And some of those behaviors trace back to that trauma response of,
absolutely.
I'm feeling this, I'm going to manipulate it so that I don't
need to get what I want. And so when I was 18, I went to a discipleship program, and I remember they wanted to pray for people that had like father wounds. And so I never looked at my life as like, oh, I have a father wound.
Right.
Because my dad, which really is one of the most amazing, both of my parents, I mean, I really got blessed in that regard with adoptive parents, provided for me in every way that they could, wanted me to have the best that they could provide. And so I never thought like, oh, I'm operating out of like a father wound. And so someone was like, you've actually never met your biological dad. You have father issues. Yeah. I was like, wow. You're like, okay.
Yeah, it's like intrinsic. It's like internal that you don't recognize it, but it is that way.
And so I took that. So it was a discipleship school that was a 6-month program. For 5 months, you really get poured into, you hear from like teachers all around the world talking about the church, and it was like a Jewish missional community. So talked about missions, talk about where it is, that's kind of like been our whole life is Jewish ministry.
Right.
That's a whole nother podcast. So I spent 5 months really getting poured into and recognizing like how entitled I am. I'm not really owed a lot, whatever. So the end of that 6 months, so that last month, you go on a mission trip you've been poured into for the last 5 months. You've learned a lot. You've really been stripped of a lot of things that you just feel like you take for granted in life.
Yeah.
We went to Ethiopia. And so I remember, this is where like, I always have to remember this because it really does keep me humble. In Ethiopia, I don't know if you know anything about their culture, but they are known as runners, number one. And number two, their worship is just something that like, they wear their Sunday best and they worship like they've never had anything, like wanted anything in their life. And
I love that.
And so I remember experiencing that, and we went to an orphanage, and we we always like have songs that we sing in English, and then we learn some in Amharic, in their language. So they wanted us to do some songs, worship songs. So we would do that in English, and then they would sing one of their songs. And it was like this back and forth, like transactional, just moment. It was really beautiful. And then they said, okay, now we want you to like hold a child and pray for that child. So this little girl found her way to me, and my whole like world broke. Because I remember the Lord gently saying, look at what I've done in your life.
Yeah.
Because this could have been you. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like I don't deserve anything, and look what God did. And like God snatched me out of the lion's mouth because like my biological dad wanted to kill me.
Right.
And like I don't have no reason to not trust the Lord. Yeah. And so it was just this little girl, she clung to me. And so I just prayed over her, and just like all the entitlement of my life melted. And I was like, I am not owed anything.
Yeah.
I'm not owed anything. I was saved, and like, here I am, Lord. Like, excuse me.
Yeah.
So that moment really marked me. I came back. My mom was like, you came back a different person. I just
you had
my
gratitude.
Relationship. Yes. Yeah. And so like, look at like the things that like I've got to do in my life because God picked me out of a really desperate situation. Right. And so I clung on to that for a long time. So I stayed with that ministry for 5 years. And in the midst of all this, so when I was doing my internship with them, I was about 21. I felt the Lord. I was actually in Israel, and we were driving along the roads of Jerusalem, and I was kind of debating on what I was going to do. Was I going to stay with the ministry on staff? Was I going to go back to school? I kind of didn't know. And I really felt like the Lord said, I think you need to go back before you can go forward. And I was like, well, that's scary. I don't know what that means. Like, what does that mean? So remember my mom had told me, we're not going to ask her again. She'll come to us. So I called them, and we went back to Cyprus. I called them, and I said, I think it's time for me to find my biological family. I have some questions. I just kind of want to know more details. Yeah. I think it's just a normal part of being an adopted person. You want to know where your origins are.
Right.
So like that was probably in March of, I think I was 21, so 2009. So my dad immediately starts calling all of, the connections that we had. How can we find them? What can we do?
Right.
And so
was this an open adoption at this point, or was it technically closed?
I think it was technically closed just because of the circumstances. This family, like
for clarity for people that don't understand adoptions, open adoption means that there is willingness on both parties to keep contact for the sake of that child, and so that if there's ever a relationship in the future that wants to be desired, that there's an option there.
Yes.
Whereas closed is one or the other side has decided that it is not in the child's best interest, or it is it's too painful to continue that communication.
Right.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think it was mostly closed just because more circumstantial. Like this family, all I knew about them, this is what my parents had told me before preteen, was that I had four other siblings. So I was the youngest of 5 at the time.
Right.
Who my biological dad, what kind of person he was. And then my biological mom, I knew her name. And that's pretty much like all I had ever known. So my dad was working behind the scenes trying to find, like, how do we find these people? What can we do? And so we connected to, the people that helped them previously when they went down there. So I was scheduled to see them in June, like literally, I think we were leaving like June 26th or something. And the day before, we hadn't heard anything. My dad was like, do you still want to go? And I was like, I do, because I would like to see the land. We scheduled to go down to Guatemala. I'd like to see just the culture, like where
do they come from?
Yeah. So he's like, okay. He says, we'll go. Literally the day before we left, they email us and they're like, we found the family. And you actually have like 9 siblings. I think I'm one of 9, one of 8. And so,
I didn't know that. That's so much like Campbell's. Campbell has 10.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So we go. I took boxed mac and cheese, just made goodie bags for them because, I didn't know what to expect. This is so crazy. So we go down there, and I could tell, for me, I had a moment where when I met my biological mother, I think it was definitely more healing for her to just see that I was okay.
You were okay.
God had done so much work in my life up until that point that I don't had I not met her, I still would have been okay.
Right.
But to meet her, it was just very surreal for me.
Yeah.
And a part of me kind of shut down because I was like, I don't know how to care for these people.
Right.
Like now I'm kind of like holding tension between this is where I come from, but then I'm going home with like my parents.
Right.
And so it was such a strange dynamic because I just, in my heart, I was like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, I don't know what else to do. Like they were so sweet. It was cool to see, that I have people that I look like.
Yeah.
It's like my whole life.
Yeah, that's something that I want you to expand on because there's so much emphasis on that. Like when we go through adoption training as like an adoptive parent, like it's very, especially when you're a multicultural family, like you need to recognize that like they're going to look at you and say, I look different. Like Campbell says, mommy and daddy and Ellie are pink or yellow. Bubby is brown, right? And he's like, I don't look like you. Or, you know, and he'll say, he has in the past said, like, there's no one around that looks like me. Oh, breaks my heart. Now, we know people that are, Micronesian and similar ethnicities, but it's not in our day-to-day life. And that's something that I kind of grieve a little bit. Yeah. And, but to hear that from you of like, it was hopeful to go and say, I have your nose or I have your eyes. Like, oh my gosh, our hair looks the same. Like that is so beneficial. I feel like.
I think that was something that kind of was missed in my childhood because my parents are both white. Yeah. So I remember later on, and this is like as an adult, right? Somebody would see my dad and they'd be like, "Oh, is your mom Hispanic?" And I'd be like, no. But I mean, like biologically.
My biological mom is,
They would kind of be a little bit like confused. And so sometimes people will be so turned off that was asked to me. On the other hand, I was kind of like, I'm not offended by it because it does like, not that it's anybody's business.
Well, I always assume that when people see me out with Campbell, that they must think his dad is Marshallese or Tongan. Like that's what people always think. And I'm like, but then when they see us all together, it's helpful that you said that it didn't offend you because I naturally, as my mama bear shield goes up and I'm like, mess with my son and I'll mess you up, like, or make him feel some type of way. And I don't want to overcompensate for that. Like, I want him to be able to form his own emotion about it. Yeah. And I don't want to assume that he is going to be offended by that. Like, he might be like, no, I'm adopted and it's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of how it felt for me. Is like I was adopted. I can tell you the story. If you want me to tell you the story. Most times people can figure it out. They're like, "Oh, okay, she must be adopted." But yeah, so it was crazy to see people that looked like me. It was such a strange, just all around dynamic because at the end of the day, I looked at my mom and I was like, I'm glad that I get to go home with you.
Oh,
and it was just like one of those things because too, it was such a wake up call for me because I have one sister I have not met. She's in Colorado somewhere, which is funny because my mom is from Colorado. It's like crazy how there's so much of the Lord intertwined that just, it was evident that God was in this whole thing.
Right.
And so, so it was just, I could see like my youngest sister at the time, she was 11 or 12. They started having kids at like 14. And like they still live, and like they live in the dumpiest of the dumps. Yeah. And like we even offered to like, which again, you kind of have to be careful because like we didn't want to just like throw this money because to them, money,
culturally, like that's they're like,
we were like, could we pay for you to finish 6th grade? And
before
like
you have a child,
it was just like it was hard. So and I wish in some regard I could have like adopted my sister, but I know my biological mom was probably like, I'm not giving up another child. I'm not.
How old was your biological mom? Do you know when she had you?
You know what? That's a great question. I don't know because by that point she had so I was number 5. So she
went on to have 4 more children.
3 more. So there's 8 of us.
8 total. Okay.
So, and my biological father is still a drunk, lives somewhere on the streets, not in a great relationship.
Not in the life of his kids at all.
So, and that's another thing too that I've kind of had to work through. I'm like, do we really want to find him? Am I okay with not knowing him, and I haven't quite explored that now. Now I'm married and have children of my own, and so it kind of brings in a whole nother dynamic because I'm like,
Right.
I really want Daniel to go with me.
Yeah.
Also, what's crazy is my husband speaks fluent Spanish. That's his first language. He doesn't look like it.
No.
He's pink. He's pink and red.
He's pink and red.
And I'm like, of course, thank you, Lord, for
Yeah.
giving me somebody who speaks.
Did you grow up speaking Spanish?
No. So that's what we were
so
talking
funny.
about. So the culture, because we also moved to a different culture that none of
Right.
us had been a part of.
Right.
It felt like some of that Latin Hispanic culture I wasn't
Was
really,
lost on you.
yes. And so, but luckily some of my best friends are like Hispanic Mexicans.
Mhm.
I always kind of like relate to like the
But that
Latina
can be very
side.
challenging. Like you're
It
like,
can.
who am I have friends who are biracial and they're like, I'm either too white for black people or I'm too black for white people.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's been an element like, and speak to this because I think it's beneficial, but like, has there been an element of like not being welcomed by the Hispanic culture? Or has that never been an issue?
I don't feel like that's really been an issue for me because I would say the majority of my community is white.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm not as dark as I could be.
Mhm.
Like, so I think I kind of just
Yeah.
meshed in really well. But there have been like jokes from like my friends, closest friends
Yeah.
have been like, yeah, you're kind of more white. Like
Yeah.
I would, highlight my hair,
Yeah.
growing up, and they were like, that's kind of a white.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, I like it.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like I experienced quite as much prejudice as I know some other people have.
Yeah.
And that just always breaks my heart because I'm like, why make it more complicated?
Oh,
than
it's
it needs
already
to be?
painful enough. Like, let's not
Yeah,
add
like-
to that. Yeah.
So, so then when, so I met them, my mom is a writer. She like wrote out the whole entire story. She has it on her blog. People go and they'll read it and just are like, wow, like, what was that like, to meet your family?
Can we put that in the show notes? Can we,
Yeah, I'm
making
sure.
a note for, yes.
It's such a, my mom documented the whole time we were there. And it was interesting too, because again, holding the tension between like, this is what my life could have looked like. Like I could have had probably like 3 children,
Yeah.
by the time
You were
I
15.
had, yes. And, but look at my life and just look what God has done. Like I don't take any credit for it, obviously. So,
And that's not to shame your biological family.
no,
See, that's the hard part is like, I don't feel that we rescued Campbell.
yeah,
I don't feel that. I feel like his life would look vastly different.
sure.
But my debt to his mom and dad
Right.
is something I'll never be able to repay.
Right.
And I live as a beneficiary of their selflessness,
Sure.
but I do hope there's a hope and an ache inside of me that like, I hope he has the same posture that you have. I hope it's a posture of gratitude that like we do love him and we tried really freaking hard to do it the best that we could and to bridge the gap between who he is now and who he, who his culture says he is and those kind of things. And that's so difficult. It is so painful for everyone involved. Everybody talks about that triangle that's an adoption of like the child is suffering the loss of its biological parents and it's also suffering not knowing who that child is. And then the biological parents are suffering the loss of their child and we're suffering the loss. Like, it's just like,
Yeah.
it's a painful process, but it's also a process of like beauty. And like,
It can be
like
so
you talked
redemptive.
about. Yes.
On and everybody's right. And I wish that like, because now we're seeing, such a pro-life movement.
Mhm.
And I wish adoption was a little bit more accepted because it doesn't
And
have
accessible.
and accessible because people
Yeah.
think that like, oh, I see people on one side, they're like, oh, I don't know that I can love a child that's really not mine. And I'm like, okay, that's the dumbest excuse I've ever heard.
Then don't do it
Don't do it.
because
Yeah.
you ain't cut out
We
for
need
it.
to do some work on
Yeah,
you.
because it is very easy. I will tell you. Yeah.
Because, and one of the things that I love that, I don't know if you know who Jimmy Evans, but
Yeah, I love
that he
Jimmy
says-
Evans.
He always talks about like the spirit, people are like, oh, family, blood is thicker than water. Well, spirit is thicker than blood.
Amen.
And like when that family, when when you open your home and your heart to
Yes.
adoption,
Yeah.
there's something special that just happens. It doesn't happen like biologically.
And
Like
it's
there is that.
inexplicable.
But
Like
yeah.
it is like that child feels like he literally came
Yeah.
from my body. Like he is my son. There is no question.
Yeah.
And it's something that, like you said, like it's something that the Holy Spirit knit together in our hearts. Like
Mhm.
it was inexplicable. The first time I saw him, I was like, oh, that's my son. Like, this is the piece that I've been missing.
Yeah.
And that I was destined to be his mom, not by way that, I thought, and not by way that his mom thought, but like this was going to happen, and God ordained it, and God searched the entire world and brought him to us. Like, it's such a beautiful thing, but there's so much fear on our end of like, is he going to resent us? Is he going to resent his biological parents? Is he going to feel abandoned? I'm sure he's going to process those emotions.
Sure. And I think that like if you make room for that, which is kind of where the counseling comes in, to process what does that look like?
Right.
And so I worked in the adoption field actually right before I went into grad school to become a therapist. And I loved the company that I worked with because they really did work with both sides. So the adoptive parents, like there would be times where I'd be like, "You guys are not ready. Like you're not ready. I think you're trying to fill a void of something, and that's not going to work.
This child isn't going to do that,
right?
No.
So let's do some work here, and then let's try again.
Yeah.
And then on the birth mom side, they had their own counselors and like really processing like,
so
what does it look like? What do you want it to look like?
Right.
And so I really wish that like there was more on that. Cause like even in the pro-life movement, they're like, oh, well, she doesn't have to give up her dreams or her baby, which is very true. Like we don't ever want a single mom.
She doesn't want to feel forced into adoption.
Right. On the other hand, I'm like, adoption doesn't have to be scary. I think there's a lot of like fear of like, how can I, like, what if they grow up and they hate me later?
Yeah.
Or what if like I regret this later?
But is God sovereign over those emotions?
Like,
that's something I have to reconcile in my own heart.
It's just like, I think that if you make room for it as adoptive parents and like as me, as like processing of like, I can love two families.
Yeah.
And like, what does that look like for me?
Right.
How do I reconcile both grief and the reality of like my life? Look what God did in my life.
Yeah.
That's making it so much better. And working towards that. So now it's crazy because now that I have my own family, I do have children that look like me.
Yeah.
So funny because I'm like, oh, now I have people that look like me, there's a healing aspect to that too. And with kids, it's like, after having my children, it's also brought up some things about from in utero and the abandonment that I've experienced in utero.
Which is, I want people to understand that adoptive kids are going to have behaviors that other children don't have because they are literally physically remembering the abandonment.
Right.
Which we don't want to shame birth moms. Birth moms are the backbone of this, but abandonment is a natural emotion for those kids. And there's things that you have to process and you have to talk through and you have to make room for as an adoptive parent that no one else has to make room for because that child's body remembers that they didn't come from you initially. And that's something that I wish someone would have sat me down and said, this is normal and it's okay.
Yeah.
And it's going to be painful to watch and it's going to be painful because you're not going to understand why he's feeling the way that he's feeling.
Right.
And you're just going to have to hold him and hug him and tell him that you love him and just let him cry and let him have his emotions. And that, no one told me that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, not to that degree of like, it's going to be ugly for a minute. There's going to be tantrums that don't make sense because he's sad. He's sad.
Yeah.
And he's trying to vocalize that. Yeah. And it's just, there's so many things that like, hey, hear me. If you're considering adoption, like, please, I don't know everything. We're still learning. He's only 4. But like, I can point you in the right direction of people that know far more than I do and that I've learned from, or connect you with people who have been adopted, because this is such a paramount conversation. It has to happen in order for there to be healing and redemption and to, in my mind, talk about the things that like aren't talked about that need to be discovered and need to be heard from people that are experiencing it and walking through it, because it doesn't have to be scary. No. And it can be beautiful and it can be exactly what the Lord intended for your life the entire time. Right?
I think in some aspects it's kind of cool because like I have 2 families.
Yeah.
And I'm not involved in one. And sometimes that's a little bit different when you have more of a local adoption. Kind of foster care, that kind of stuff. And so I think that like when you start to recognize it's also about like what's the best interest of the child.
Right.
And sometimes
because
that might
sometimes
be
connecting with the bio family is dangerous, and it's not. Like, there was a reason that child was removed. Yeah.
And so I think it's like every case is just so different and unique. But I think that if you can make room for the hard questions, because like even with Campbell, like as he gets older, you know, preparing yourself for like those hard moments of like he might kind of be upset at you for a little while, just as he's working through what does this actually mean for me, and trusting the Lord to bring him through that to where on the other side he'll see like, okay, like I can have both feelings. I can love them, but also be like, why?
Sad. Yeah.
Like,
why did she not want me?
Why?
Well, and he's in the middle of, he was like at the tail end. So he's one of the youngest ones. There was 3 children placed for adoption at the end, like in her birth order. And I can imagine that he's going to feel like, why did they keep these children and not me? And that, I think that's so helpful for me to hear you say, like, he can have both. He can have both emotions. He can recognize that, you know, he has loss, but also that he's grateful.
Yeah.
Because it's hard in my brain sometimes to be like, oh, he's just going to hate me. You know, he's going to hate me thinking I'm this white lady that came and snatched him in the night, and that's not what happened, you know? And so...
And that's a whole nother belief where I see people commenting about like adoption, and they're like, well, now, you know, all the people that have money just want to rescue somebody.
I didn't have money.
Well,
I didn't have no damn money. I had to go broke to get this boy, and I would do it 10 times over again.
And like, there's just so much missing in the adoption world.
Right.
That people just don't know, and they're like...
It's just uneducation.
It is, and it's like, if you'll open up your heart to what it can look like.
Right.
And again, like looking at the best interest of the child and looking at the, you know, what the birth mom wants, the situation that she's in, like it can be really beautiful and very redemptive on both parties. Yeah. And I want that for people. I want people to have that understanding and not just be like, oh, like,
and I think it's
too messy. And I'm like, life is supposed to be messy.
Yeah, you're supposed to get down in the dirt. It says bear one another's burdens for a reason. And like, and there's sometimes where like, I think the natural bent is to feel bad for the birth mom, which rightfully so. Her circumstances put her in a situation where she had to make a decision that's unfathomable. But also there's times where birth moms are like, I know that this is the right decision. Right. I have peace about this. I have joy in my heart knowing that I am laying down my life so that my child isn't in the same situation that I'm in. Like that is the most beautiful, most selfless, like any birth mom. I'm like, I got you. Like I'm on your freaking team because I understand on the other side of it, what you had to give up so that I could have this boy and he could have this life. Like this is, and not that we are doing it perfectly or like aren't going to screw him up in some degree because I'm sure that we're freaking humans. But I think
welcome to parenting.
Yeah, right. It doesn't change with it's going to be just as messy. Wow. Okay. I want to make sure that we've talked through. So there's just, I feel like you could just go on and on because you're so wise in this department, but there's more to you than being an adoptive person. And so I want to talk about that. So talk about marriage because you
oh boy,
because Daniel is such a blessing. I have actually not met him, but I had the privilege of being his parents' realtor, and I literally am obsessed with them. I asked them if they would adopt me because I'm so obsessed with them. They're the kindest human beings. So tell me about your marriage. Tell me about just like quickly how the Lord has used marriage in your life to sanctify you and to bring you to the place that you're at now.
Oh, man. Let's see. So Daniel and I, so we've been married 5 years this year. We have 3 children. One on the way.
One on the way.
Woo! I just feel like our whole life is just taking off. I mean, marriage in itself, you know, so I'm a marriage therapist. That is something that I do professionally. And so I really have a heart because I do believe that marriage, you know, that is really the backbone of a solid family.
I agree.
And so when you invest in your marriage and you do the hard work and really learning to self-sacrifice, that really paves the way for your children later on in life. Yeah. And I just think like that is so important just for everyone to understand. And so for Daniel and I, like Daniel, you know, his story is a little bit different. He didn't grow up in the church like I did. He had a very wild, I feel like that's kind of like his story to tell.
Yeah.
But he is in recovery. He's a recovered drug addict. And that in itself is a miracle. And so I feel like like we've really had to work at a lot of hard things, because with that also comes a certain type of baggage. And then you're looking at somebody who also has like abandonment issues and rejection issues, like having to work through my own stuff. And so, but I think like with our marriage, like we're at a place where communication is like, we communicate about everything. And there's some things where I don't like that he communicates. And I'm like, okay, would I rather him tell me or not tell me?
Right.
You know, I'm like, tell me how he really feels about certain things and vice versa. And so, I mean, we definitely don't have it perfect, but I do think that like we have a very honest relationship, and that in itself has like been hard to work at, because I'm like, here I am like having to learn to be vulnerable with somebody. And you're talking again, somebody who has all these like other issues of like, are you going to love me?
Yeah.
If I like tell you these things, are you going to like, you know,
are you going to run?
Are you going to run for me? Or, you know, is there something that I can do? I guess like for me specifically, it's like, I want you to love me. So I'm going to kind of manipulate things so that way you don't leave me.
Yeah.
But also I think on his side, as a recovered drug addict, he lived a life of manipulation. He's like, I know what you're doing.
Yeah.
It's like, I know what you're doing.
Stop it.
And he's like, stop.
Let me just
like,
love
let
you.
me just love you.
Yeah.
Let's like work this out together. And I'm like, this is so irritating. Like,
my tactics don't work. Yeah.
You know, and so we both can kind of like work on that. And so, or work, you know, with each other, you know, I'm like, I know what you're doing.
But I think that's so beneficial that the Lord knew, like,
oh, totally. And I mean, like he speaks Spanish. So his family, they did, you know, his dad was in mining. And so he was born in Mexico.
Right.
He looks like Santa Claus.
He does.
But he speaks fluent Spanish. So I think like it was just so ordained by the Lord that like, you know, because I would love to take him to Guatemala with me and to be like our translator, because we had a translator last time that was a family friend of ours. But, you know, to hear it from like coming through like my husband, I just think like that will mean something.
That's
and
so beautiful.
We're kind of looking at that, you know, like what does that look like for our family? Should we take our kids? Should it just be like Dino and I first? Like, you know, I don't even know where my biological family is right now. Again, that was 2009.
Yeah.
But, you know, so marriage in itself, I mean, like, it is a constant dying to yourself.
100%.
And there are some days where I'm like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
And
you do it. No, you do it. I don't want to do it today.
You add children, especially small children. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like how much more? Like there's not going to be anything left of me. And then there are times where the Lord is like, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing
I want
left
you to
of
beat up yourself and
like,
full of my spirit. Yeah.
You know, I don't like this.
But I think you do such a good job at it. And you do such a good job at the daily work.
Thank you. I try. There are definitely days where I'm like, I'm not nailing it today. Just not nailing it. But that's just being honest.
Humanity,
that's being real, you know, and learning to, I guess, motherhood in itself also, you know, it does test every.
I would argue more so than marriage.
Yes, it does, because it's just like, and I don't know if that's just because like, you know, obviously in a marriage, you can like separate and divorce, which we don't.
Right.
You know, it's not what we hope for. But then with your children, it's like you can't really ever be like, bye.
Yeah.
Like you need space from me, or like, you know, you lived in my house. Like there's just not that kind of like separation that can really happen. But you know, all around, like, I mean, I love talking about marriage. I love like working with my couples on like communication. And I'm like, there's just so many aspects to marriage that I just wish more people would know too. Where I'm like, it'll be one of the hardest things that you do, but it'll also be one of the most fun and rewarding. Yeah. Like to share your life with somebody and have a foundation. You know, we really, I try to like kind of go back to the foundation of like, what is your marriage built on?
Yeah. I think it's the most meaningful work I've ever done. And
it'll be the hardest work you've ever done.
That I married someone that doesn't make it feel excruciatingly hard. I think we talk about this on his podcast that he has coming out tomorrow, actually, but it's recorded backwards. But so we talk about that, how like I've been very fortunate that the work feels like it's just kind of tug and pull because we're best friends. And like, I think I'm at a place in my marriage where I don't want to wound him, right? Like early on in marriage, this is probably something you can speak to. Like initially it's like, no, you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. Right. And now I'm like, man, I just really love you and I don't want to wound you. Like I don't, that's not a desire in my heart. Like I don't care about getting even anymore. I care about at the end of this conversation, are we going to have a respect for one another and are we going to love each other? And I think that's something that you teach people so well too, is like, you don't get to like erase those things.
Right.
Like,
right.
they're going to remember.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And that's so important. And I think that talking about that daily work is really important.
It is. And I mean, I think about like, you know, also I'm an only child, so I didn't have to share a lot of things. And so I'm like, okay, this is hard.
Yeah.
Like, this is hard. I'm having to like share like
not only with my husband, but
life.
children.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just very humbling. And so, but yeah, the getting even one is also like something that's been like where I don't find myself as being a very like vengeful person, but if you hurt me enough, then I'm gonna be like,
the claws are coming out.
Yeah, I'm gonna be like, no, this is not okay.
Yeah.
Some of it could be trauma response. Some of it could just be a protective mechanism. Because
see, that's where I feel like it comes from for me. I don't think it's ever malicious. It's like, oh, okay, I have to defend. Right. I'm gonna like scare you off.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, and Daniel and I actually talk about that too, because it's like, it's kind of like one of those things that I think this is a similar fight that I'm pretty sure everybody has experienced in their life, is like, who's more tired?
My God.
And I'm like, just because I say I'm tired, I'm not inviting you to say that you're tired.
No,
too.
Like, it's a fact. It doesn't need to be reciprocated. Yeah.
I know you're tired, but this is my time to talk about how tired I am.
Yeah.
And so that's something where it's like when some of my friends, when they first started having kids, I'm like, have y'all had that fight yet? And I'm like, who's more tired?
Yeah.
But it's also just like learning to communicate in that of like, there are times where I'm like, I need you to just empathize with me.
Not fix it.
And not fix it.
Man,
men just want
to fix it. Okay, but see, in our relationship, it's opposite. Like, Dylan just wants to be heard. And I'm like, I have a solution to that problem. Like, let me just sew it up, you know? And he's like, I didn't need that. I just wanted you to hear me say that, like, I don't feel good.
Yep.
Or like, today was crap. And I'm like, okay, well, how do we work through that? And he's like, no, that's not what I needed. So it's hard. I can empathize with the man asked.
That is so funny. I love it because I do get couples that are like reversed. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like that's new. I love it. You know,
I'm a problem solver by nature.
Yeah. So it's just a lot of communication, a lot of like I would rather couples over communicate than under communicate.
100%.
And I'm like, we can work with the over communication a lot easier. I don't want to say necessarily like faster, easier, but
then someone who's just clammed up.
Yes. Yeah. I'm like, we've got to like
pull it out of them. And I feel like you are very good at that, like pulling that out of.
I mean, I do. I love couples work. A lot of people actually don't really enjoy it as much. They would prefer to work with an individual, but I just think more in systems. I'm like, okay, you guys are a part of a system. So how are we going to make this system how are we going to make this system work? How do we make it flow better? So
I love that. I love that. That's such a good analogy. It's a system. And when one breaks down, the system doesn't work.
Right.
That's so cool. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about so much. We could talk forever. I love it. But I want you to say one thing, if you could tell yourself or someone that is either adopted or an adoptive parent, like one bit of information that you feel like, just like one little, like, this has like really helped me. If you could talk to that.
Like, what would I tell myself?
What would you tell yourself? Maybe your younger self that was like reconciling with the adoption. Like, what would you say?
It's a great question. And I read this and I was like, oh, I should be so prepared for this question.
It's a hard question.
I feel like there's quite a few things that I would say. Number one is like, you don't have to work so hard for love.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one, I feel like you're accepted for who you are.
Yeah.
And even the messy parts.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't have to hide those.
Yeah.
And I think that the more that you get used to allowing people to see the messy parts, trusted people, not just anybody, but trusted people, it gets easier to like even accept yourself of like, okay, see, like they're not running from me.
Yeah.
Because I'm messy. I don't have it all figured out. Or I have these ugly emotions. But they're still here.
Wow.
And so I think that like finding your tribe, especially I feel like as an adopted person, finding my tribe is very important.
Yeah.
My community is very important. When I feel like the community is shifting or changing in relationships or just like even when we moved, that was very like difficult. And so I think like that is something that I would encourage even adopted parents to have, is like have a solid community of people that you can rely on when they have those tantrums. When they have those big emotions and you're just like, what am I doing as a parent? Like, am I failing?
Yeah.
Am I not communicating? It's just like a reminder, like having them remind you, like you're just making space for their mess.
Emotions. Yeah.
Everybody wants to be accepted in their mess.
Oh, so Lee, that is so
I think that like that's
helpful
just,
to hear.
That would be something like I thrive with our tribe and community.
And stability.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, that is just something where I could just say, like, if you have that solid foundation of just those people around you and will love your child, adopted or not, is life-changing. And so I'm all about community. That's one of the first things I ask people when they come into counseling is like, tell me about your community.
Because it's so important.
Yeah.
It's so important, especially, and as an adoptive mom, like, there were so many times where I was so unsure of what was ahead of us in that adoption process. And I was so afraid that it wasn't going to happen because we had a failed adoption. You know about that. Yeah. And that was really challenging. And then, you know, even since then, since adopting Campbell, we didn't close our doors initially. We just were like, we're going to foster. We're going to see what the Lord wants from us. Yeah. If he wants us to have more kids, we will. Like, our doors are open and I think our hearts are still postured that way.
Yeah.
But I would say our community carried us in the moments of like, this is something as a community that we're navigating together. And they were so good about meeting my needs when I was so unsure of what was coming or the uncertainty of, are they going to change their mind? And then once we had him, okay, we didn't have a baby shower because you don't want to have a baby shower when you don't know if you're bringing a baby home because that's freaking traumatizing. I've done that. You know what I mean? And so there's so much that I rely on them still and call and, you know, my best friends. And when it's been a hard day or when someone reacts negatively to a tantrum or something like that, like, it's crucial for your people. I cannot. So from the adoptive side, that's huge. And as an adoptive parent, like, that is huge to have your people there. So, man, I love you. I love your heart. I love your story. I love the way that you articulate it. I think that it is so important to hear from you and to hear from people that have perspective on things that we just don't. And so I'm very, very thankful and humbled that you chose to share that with me and my people.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Yes. This is so fun. It's a topic that I love talking about. I can talk about adoption, marriage, counseling, all the things. Mental health, church, you know.
I love it.
Lots of stuff to talk about.
Well, and I do want to just, like, not to, like, tie it up in a pretty bow, but I do want you guys to hear me say, like, adoption is something that is so wonderful, and it's something that you should pray about and consider. And not only like adopting from a third world country or from, you know, us outside of the US, but like there are so many children in foster care that need to be adopted. And it is so much more feasible and accessible when you do it through the state. And so if that is something that's on your heart, please feel free to reach out to me, reach out to someone that you know that has adopted or is adopted, and talk about that, because it can absolutely change your life for the better and make you a kinder, more gentle human being.
And don't be afraid to get your heart broken.
Yes, get your dang heart broken for them kids. Like, my heart's been broken 6 times over with our adoption placements or our foster care placements. Like, there's so much to that is so beautiful, and so what the Lord intended when he talked about caring for all the people groups, right? So I love it. I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
Yeah, okay, love you. Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to my mom's podcast, Let's Just Be Real. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, follow, rate, and review so you don't miss any of these honest and amazing stories. For all of the behind-the-scenes content, go follow my mom at Jordyn Swingle on Instagram. And as always, let's just be real.